Hi everyone. So in this video, we are going to talk about the dissociative disorders, and this will cover pages 532 to 535. So the first thing we're going to talk about is what a dissociative experience is. And it's basically just a disruption in our consciousness. We might lose track of time, who we are, where we are, etc. And mild dissociations are actually fairly common and are considered normal. If you've ever been in the middle of doing something and completely lost track of time, you've had a mild dissociative experience. Now, in some cultures, they actually regard dissociative experiences as highly valued and even considered to be religious experiences. So one example of this is the Native Americans. There are particular tribes who believe that these dissociative experiences allow you to connect with the spirits and believe that they're extremely critical to happen in a person's life. Now, dissociative disorders occur when these disruptions actually impair the ability for a person to function in the world. And awareness or recognition of familiar surroundings or maybe even people can be obstructed. And they might not have any memory of any pertinent personal information. So they might not know who they are, where they live. They might have none of that information. That identity can either be completely lost or confused. Maybe they remember their first name and not their last name, or it can just be fragmented where they can only pick up pieces of things. So there are actually two different categories of dissociative disorders, and the first one is the dissociative amnesia, and it's partial or total inability to recall important personal information. So this inability to recall is not due to any kind of medical condition like an illness or an injury, and it's not due to drugs. The person might be able to remember things like how to read, how to write, who important historical figures are, but they can't remember anything about himself or herself. And in most cases, it's a response to stress or trauma. There could be an extremely distressing situation like combat or marital problems or physical abuse that can bring this on. Now, it can occur with or without what they call dissociative fugue. And that's a type of dissociative amnesia where the person will suddenly travel away from home as part of the identity confusion. Well, in this fugue state, the person will just inexplicably travel away from home, could move to another city, maybe even another country. And these fugues are thought to be associated with traumatic events or stressful periods, but they're really not clear how a fugue state develops or why a person would develop a fugue state as opposed to just developing anxiety or depression. When the person awakens from the fugue state, he or she might remember the past, but have no recollection from the time while they were in the fugue state, have no idea what they did while they were away from home. So the second disorder is dissociative identity disorder, and it's formerly known as multiple personality disorder. So if you've ever heard of multiple personality disorder or MPD, DID or dissociative identity disorder is the same thing. It's this new term. So it involves extensive memory disruptions for personal information, along with the presence of two or more distinct identities or personalities within a single person. Now, each personality usually has his or her own name, experiences, personal history, self-image, traits, all of that. And these alternative personalities are usually called either alters or alter egos. They can vary in ages, different genders. It's not uncommon for there to be a mix of males and females, perhaps even different races. All of this is common in dissociative identity disorder. So the alters are not really separate people. They just seem to embody different aspects of the individual's personality that for some reason can't be integrated into that primary personality. These alternate personalities all hold memories, emotions, motives that are not admissible to the individual's conscious mind. Now, these different alter egos can take control of the person's experiences and thoughts and behaviors. And that primary personality is completely unaware of the existence of these alternate personalities. Now, these alter egos might actually have knowledge of each other. They might even share memories. Sometimes the experiences of one alter are accessible to another, but not vice versa as well. So if you've seen the movie Split or the movie Identity with John Cusack, it is actually showing you depictions of people with dissociative identity disorder. So those are two great movies to check out if you have the time. So to get a diagnosis, one of the first things that people usually have pop up, they'll have amnesia and memory problems. They are characteristics of nearly every case of dissociative identity disorder. They'll have gaps of memory. They have no idea where they were during a certain time. They may suddenly find themselves in a place and have no idea how they got there. They also typically have numerous psychiatric and physical symptoms along with the chaotic personal history. They'll have symptoms of things like major depressive disorder, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, substance abuse, sleep disorders, self-destructive behavior. All of these are common. And often the patient with dissociative identity disorder has been diagnosed with a variety of other psychological disorders before a DID diagnosis is made. Now, not all mental health professionals are convinced that dissociative identity disorder is a real disorder. So if we look at it historically, beginning of modern medicine in the 1700s up until the 1940s, there were only 76 documented cases of dissociative identity disorder. Then in the 1950s and 60s, we got a couple more cases. In the 1970s, there was a huge surge in dissociative identity disorder diagnoses. Now, all this happened after there were a bunch of books and films and television dramas about multiple personality disorder, and people started learning more about it. And not only that, but not only did the number of cases increase, but the number of alters showed a dramatic increase. Whereas before people may have only had 2 or 3, suddenly there were 4, 5, 6. So that kind of thing was happening. Now, to some psychologists, they look at it and they say that the patients with dissociative identity disorder learned how to behave like a multiple from all the media portrayals and through sensational cases, or perhaps by responding to their therapist's suggestions in therapy. People with another mental illness or a vulnerability might actually be particularly susceptible to the influence of others, whether it be through books they've read or through a therapist. So one study actually concluded, in terms of key symptoms of the disorder, people taught to simulate DID are largely indistinguishable from people actually diagnosed with DID. So there is a case for it possibly being, that there are more cases than there actually are. But on the other hand, dissociative identity disorder is not the only psychological disorder for which prevalence rates have actually increased over time. For example, if we look at rates of obsessive compulsive disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder, they have both also increased over the past few decades. Now, this is primarily because mental health professionals have become more aware of these disorders and are more likely to be screening for symptoms. So it's completely possible that therapists are just more aware of the symptoms of DID and are doing more screenings for it. So when we look at explaining dissociative identity disorder, it usually represents an extreme form of dissociative coping. A very high percentage of patients with dissociative identity disorder have suffered extreme physical or sexual abuse in childhood. In fact, over 90% in most surveys. So according to this, dissociation might just be a way to cope with trauma. The child dissociates him or herself from the trauma and creates an alternative personality to experience the trauma. Alternate personalities are created to deal with the memories and emotions associated with intolerably painful experiences as well. Anger, rage, fear, and guilt that are too powerful for a child to consciously integrate might be dissociated into these alternative personalities. Dissociation becomes a pathological defense mechanism that the person uses to cope with these overwhelming experiences. So dissociative coping theory is actually difficult to test empirically because memories of childhood are notoriously unreliable. And since DID is usually diagnosed in adulthood, it's very difficult and often impossible to determine whether reports of childhood abuse are actually real or imaginary. Another issue with the traumatic memory explanation is that just the opposite effect occurs in most trauma victims. They're bothered by the recurring and intrusive memories of that traumatic event. They may relive that event over and over and over. In fact, more than 80% of young adults with a documented history of childhood sexual abuse remembered that abuse. The scientific debate about the validity of dissociative identity disorder is likely to continue for some time. So I hope that if you have time, you check out the movie Split in Identity. They're both really good. They have a very good portrayal of what dissociative identity disorder is actually like. And within our D2L shell, I've actually also posted for you a video of an actual case of a person suffering from that dissociative fugue and what happened with her, so that you can actually take a look at her story as well.